There is a version of human history that gets taught in schools. In that version, your ancestors were clever toolmakers who invented fire, built shelters, formed tribes, and slowly climbed their way to the top of the food chain through ingenuity and persistence. It is a good story. It is mostly true, and it leaves out the part that actually explains why you are alive right now. Because the real story of human survival is not about what your ancestors built. It is about what they were willing to do to each other, and to themselves, and to the world around them. And most of it was never supposed to be widely known, not because anyone deliberately hid it, but because the truth of how your species survived is deeply, uncomfortably strange. Let us start with the part everyone knows. About 2 million years ago, early members of the genus Homo began making stone tools. The Oldowan toolkit, hand axes, scrapers, basic, effective, revolutionary. Researchers like archaeologist Thomas Wynn at the University of Colorado have spent careers analyzing these tools and what they reveal about the minds that made them. The conclusion is humbling. The cognitive demand of making an Oldowan hand axe is roughly equivalent to what a modern chimpanzee can achieve. Your ancestors were not geniuses. They were not dramatically smarter than what came before them. They were just slightly more persistent, slightly more socially connected, and operating in an environment that rewarded those marginal advantages with survival. That is the first thing you were not supposed to know. Human dominance did not begin with intelligence. It began with stubbornness. The second thing goes deeper. For the vast majority of your ancestral history, your lineage was not at the top of the food chain. It was not even close. Paleoanthropologist Robert Blumenschine at Rutgers University spent years studying the feeding ecology of early hominins in the Serengeti landscape and concluded something that most popular accounts of human prehistory simply skip over. Your ancestors, for hundreds of thousands of years, were scavengers, not hunters, not apex predators. They were the creatures that arrived at a kill site after the lions had eaten and the hyenas had finished and the vultures had picked the bones, and they cracked open whatever was left to get at the fat-rich marrow inside. You come from the animals that ate what everyone else left behind. And that is not a shameful thing. It is a brilliant thing. Because bone marrow is extraordinarily calorie-dense. It is protected inside bone precisely because it is so valuable. And the cognitive leap of understanding that the thing worth eating is inside the thing that looks like trash, that is a form of intelligence that has no parallel in the animal kingdom at the time. Your ancestors were not weak. They were playing a longer game than any predator on the plain. The third thing is about fire. You know your ancestors used fire. What you may not know is how recently they learned to control it, and what it did to them when they did. The best archaeological evidence places reliable, controlled fire use at roughly 400,000 years ago, though some disputed sites suggest earlier use. Researcher Richard Wrangham at Harvard has proposed what he calls the cooking hypothesis, the idea that cooking food was not simply a convenience but the single most transformative event in human biological history. Cooking breaks down the cellular structure of food before it enters the body. It dramatically reduces the energy cost of digestion. It makes nutrients bioavailable that would otherwise pass through the gut unused. And it effectively pre-digests food outside the body, freeing up enormous amounts of metabolic energy that the body had previously dedicated to running one of the most expensive digestive systems in the primate lineage. That freed energy went somewhere. It went to the brain. And the brain, released from the metabolic constraints that had limited its growth for millions of years, expanded with a speed that has no parallel in the evolutionary record. In roughly 200,000 years, the human brain nearly doubled in size. Not because humans became smarter and then discovered fire. Because they discovered fire and then became smarter. The fourth thing is the darkest. It is the one that gets left out of almost every popular account of human origins, because it implicates every person alive today in something that feels like it should be classified. Your ancestors did not just outcompete other species. They eliminated them, deliberately, systematically, with a thoroughness that left virtually no trace of the creatures that shared the planet with them. When Homo sapiens arrived in Australia roughly 65,000 years ago, the continent was home to a megafauna assemblage of extraordinary diversity. Giant wombats the size of cars, marsupial lions, a bird called Genyornis that stood nearly 7 feet tall. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, virtually all of them were gone. The same pattern repeated in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. In Madagascar 4,000 years ago. In New Zealand 700 years ago. Everywhere modern humans arrived, the large animals disappeared with a speed and completeness that cannot be fully explained by climate change alone. Researcher Paul Martin at the University of Arizona spent his career documenting what he called the prehistoric overkill hypothesis, the idea that your ancestors were not passive bystanders to these extinctions. They were the cause. This is not presented to make you feel guilty. Guilt for events that happened thousands of generations before your birth is a category error. This is presented because understanding what your ancestors were capable of, the coordination, the persistence, the cognitive sophistication required to systematically hunt an entire megafauna to extinction across multiple continents, reveals something about your species that the comfortable version of human history obscures. You did not survive because you were gentle. You survived because you were effective. The fifth thing is perhaps the most personal. It is about the other humans. Because for most of human prehistory, your ancestors were not the only humans on the planet. There were others. Neanderthals, who had larger brains than you on average and had survived in Europe for over 200,000 years. Denisovans, about whom we know remarkably little except that they were sophisticated enough to produce jewelry and tools that modern humans did not match until much later. And possibly others we have not yet found. All of them are gone now. Your species is the only human species left on Earth. For a long time, the dominant theory was that your ancestors simply outcompete the others, that Homo sapiens were cognitively superior and the other species faded away through resource competition. The picture that has emerged from ancient DNA research, led by Nobel Prize-winning researcher Svante Paabo at the Max Planck Institute, is considerably more complicated and considerably more intimate. Your ancestors did not simply outcompete Neanderthals. They met them. They traded with them. In some places, they lived alongside them for thousands of years. And they interbred with them. If you are of non-African descent, roughly 1 to 4% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. They are not gone. They are inside you. What happened to the Neanderthals as a distinct population remains genuinely contested. Disease, climate, resource competition, direct conflict. The evidence supports multiple explanations and no single narrative is complete. But the outcome is not contested. The other humans are gone. And you are the one still here. The sixth thing is about what you chose to remember and what you chose to forget. Every human culture that has ever existed has developed mythology, ritual, and story as a way of encoding the survival knowledge of the past into a form that could be transmitted to the future. The stories your ancestors told around campfires were not entertainment. They were manuals. They carried information about which plants were poisonous, which routes were safe, how to read weather, how to negotiate with strangers, what betrayal looks like before it happens. Anthropologist Joseph Henrich at Harvard has argued extensively that the single most important cognitive adaptation in human evolution was not intelligence itself but what he calls cultural learning, the ability to absorb, store, and transmit the accumulated knowledge of the group across generations with a fidelity and complexity that no other species can match. You are not smart because your brain is large. You are smart because your brain is specifically wired to learn from other people, to stand on the shoulders of everyone who came before you, and to add your own understanding to a cumulative body of knowledge that stretches back further than any individual mind can comprehend. The knowledge of how to survive was never meant to be held by any single person. It was always meant to be held by the group. And the group was always meant to be bigger than you could see. This is the thing you were not supposed to know, not because it was hidden, but because the true scale of it, the full depth of what your species endured, what it destroyed, what it absorbed, what it carried, and what it became, is almost too large to hold in a single mind. But here is what you can hold. You are the end product of an unbroken chain of survivors stretching back 2 million years. Every ancestor you have ever had lived long enough to reproduce. Every obstacle that should have ended your lineage, the predators, the scarcity, the competing species, the climate shifts, the diseases, the betrayals, the extinctions, every single one of them was survived. Not by the strongest, not by the most intelligent, but by the ones who were connected enough, adaptable enough, and stubborn enough to make it one more day. That is what you come from. That is what you are made of. And now you know.